Dangerous prisons are characterized by violence, overcrowding, and corruption. When we think of a prison, we often imagine a secure facility where criminals serve time for their offenses under strict regulations. However, in many parts of the world, prisons are far from being controlled environments. Instead, they become breeding grounds for extreme violence, lawlessness, and corruption, making survival inside them a daily battle. One of the biggest factors contributing to the dangers of these prisons is overcrowding. Many prisons house far more inmates than they were originally designed for. Cells meant for 2 or 3 people often hold 10 or more, forcing inmates to sleep on floors or in shared, unsanitary spaces. This lack of space leads to increased tension among prisoners, which often erupts into brutal fights and riots. Overcrowding also causes shortages of essential supplies like food, water, and medical care, making life inside these prisons unbearable. Another major issue is violence. In some of the world's most dangerous prisons, inmates are not just serving their sentences, they are fighting for their lives. Gangs run many of these facilities, exerting more control than the prison guards themselves. These gangs enforce their own brutal rules, and those who refuse to comply face severe punishment, including beatings, torture, or even death. Some prisons become battlegrounds where rival factions engage in deadly clashes, sometimes leading to mass killings. Corruption further worsens conditions in these prisons. In many of these facilities, guards and officials turn a blind eye to criminal activities in exchange for bribes. Some officers actively participate in smuggling drugs, weapons, and other contraband, giving inmates the tools to continue their violent lifestyles behind bars. Others use their power to abuse prisoners, demanding money for basic needs such as food, clean water, or even protection from harm. In the worst cases, corrupt prison staff sell weaker inmates into servitude or force them to fight for entertainment. The combination of these 3 elements, overcrowding, violence, and corruption, turns prisons into lawless environments where justice is absent and survival depends on power, fear, and brutality. These conditions not only make life unbearable for inmates, but also make rehabilitation almost impossible. Instead of reforming criminals, these prisons often turn them into more hardened offenders, ensuring that once they are released, they are even more dangerous than before. Some prisons are ruled by gangs rather than authorities. In a well-functioning prison system, law enforcement officials maintain strict control over inmates, ensuring order, discipline, and security. However, in some of the world's most dangerous prisons, the reality is the complete opposite. Instead of being managed by guards and authorities, these prisons are controlled by powerful gangs that enforce their own brutal rules and operate with almost complete impunity. One of the most infamous examples is El Salvador's East Salcah prison, which houses thousands of members of the notorious MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs. These rival gangs dictate everything inside the prison, from daily routines to punishments and even executions. Guards rarely intervene, fearing violent retaliation. Inmates who refuse to join a gang often become victims of relentless beatings or even murder. The gang leaders inside the prison communicate with their associates outside, running criminal operations such as drug trafficking, extortion, and assassinations, all from within the prison walls. Another terrifying example is La Sabaneta prison in Venezuela before it was shut down. Inside, gang leaders had more power than the prison staff. The strongest inmates controlled access to food, water, and sleeping areas, forcing weaker prisoners to pay for basic necessities or risk deadly consequences. Corrupt guards allowed this system to persist, accepting bribes to look the other way while gangs operated freely. The result was a lawless, chaotic environment where violent confrontations and massacres were a regular occurrence. In the San Pedro prison of Bolivia, the entire facility functions like an independent city, with inmates running shops, businesses, and even renting out accommodations. However, behind this seemingly unusual system lies an underworld of violence. Drug cartels and gang leaders control the internal economy, using intimidation and force to maintain power. Those who cannot afford protection or rent space are often left vulnerable to violence or exploitation. In prisons ruled by gangs, justice does not exist. Inmates enforce their own version of law, often carrying out executions or extreme punishments for perceived betrayals or disrespect. Newcomers are forced to either join a gang for survival or live in constant fear. In many cases, these prisons become training grounds for future criminals, where young offenders are recruited, hardened, and prepared for a life of crime even before they are released. The absence of effective law enforcement inside these prisons not only endangers inmates, but also creates a significant problem for society. Instead of reducing crime, these facilities become headquarters for organized criminal networks, allowing gang leaders to continue their operations unhindered. Without proper intervention and reforms, these prisons remain beyond government control, fostering environments where the most ruthless individuals thrive while others suffer in silence. A Sabaneta prison in Venezuela was a lawless, violent nightmare. Among the world's most dangerous prisons, few were as notorious as La Sabaneta prison in Venezuela before it was finally shut down in 2013. This facility was infamous for its extreme overcrowding, lack of government control, and the unchecked violence that made life inside a waking nightmare. Originally built to house around 700 inmates, La Sabaneta was eventually crammed with over 3,700 prisoners, creating an environment of chaos, disease, and extreme brutality. The prison had far too few guards to maintain order, and those who were present often turned a blind eye or actively participated in corruption, allowing the prison to become a battlefield controlled by violent gangs. Without proper management, the most dangerous inmates took control, running the prison like a personal kingdom where only the strongest survived. The conditions inside La Sabaneta were beyond inhumane. Basic necessities such as food, water, and medical care were scarce, and inmates had to fight for survival daily. Prisoners who had no gang affiliation were particularly vulnerable, as they were often extorted for protection, beaten, or even killed over minor disputes. The lack of running water meant that hygiene was non-existent, leading to the rapid spread of disease, with infections and untreated wounds often proving fatal. Violence was an everyday occurrence in La Sabaneta. Gangs waged brutal wars for dominance, often using makeshift weapons to carry out attacks. Massacres were not uncommon. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in 1994 when a prison riot led to the deaths of over 100 inmates in a single day. Some were burned alive, while others were shot or hacked to death in the chaos. The authorities were powerless to stop it, as they lacked both the numbers and the control to restore order. Even for those who managed to stay out of the constant gang wars, life in La Sabaneta was a constant battle for survival. Corrupt guards often demanded bribes for everything from food rations to slightly better living conditions. Those who couldn't pay were left to fend for themselves in the overcrowded, unsanitary cells, where disease and malnutrition claimed just as many lives as violence. The prison became known as a hell on earth, a place where justice no longer existed, and survival was the only goal. Although La Sabaneta was eventually shut down due to its horrific reputation, its legacy serves as a grim reminder of what happens when lawlessness takes over a correctional facility. The extreme violence, corruption, and inhumane conditions that define this prison reflect a broader issue within many prison systems worldwide, where mismanagement and neglect turn facilities into breeding grounds for further crime and suffering. Black Dolphin Prison in Russia houses the worst criminals under extreme security. Among the world's most feared and highly secure prisons, Black Dolphin Prison in Russia stands as one of the most brutal. Located near the Kazakhstan border, this facility is reserved for the most dangerous and violent criminals in the country: serial killers, terrorists, cannibals, and mass murderers. The inmates housed here are considered beyond rehabilitation, and as a result, the prison operates under conditions so strict that escape is virtually impossible, and daily life is more about existence than living. One of the most chilling aspects of Black Dolphin is the psychological and physical control imposed on its prisoners. The facility follows an extreme security protocol, ensuring that inmates have no opportunities to resist or plan any form of rebellion. Whenever prisoners are moved, they are blindfolded to prevent them from memorizing the layout of the prison. They're also forced to bend at the waist, with their arms twisted behind their backs, while guards escort them. This humiliating position serves multiple purposes. It limits their ability to see their surroundings, keeps them disoriented, and makes it nearly impossible to resist or escape. The conditions inside the cells are among the harshest in the world. Each inmate is locked inside a small, heavily fortified concrete cell, where they spend 23 hours a day under constant surveillance. The cells have 3 sets of iron doors, ensuring that no one can break out. There are no personal belongings, no interaction with other prisoners, and barely any human contact aside from the guards. Inmates are given only 1 hour of exercise per day, and even this takes place in a small, enclosed cage. There is no access to television, newspapers, or outside communication, which means that prisoners are completely cut off from the world beyond their cell. One of the defining features of Black Dolphin is the way it destroys any hope of escape or release. The prison houses inmates who are serving life sentences without parole, meaning that they will never leave unless they die. Unlike other prisons where there might be a possibility of reform or reduced sentencing, Black Dolphin operates on the principle that the inmates inside are too dangerous to ever return to society. Some of the prisoners have committed such horrific crimes that even among criminals, they are considered beyond redemption. The daily routine at Black Dolphin is one of strict discipline and constant control. Inmates must wake up early and stand in their cells for roll call multiple times a day. They are not allowed to sit or rest during certain hours, ensuring that they remain in a constant state of exhaustion. Their meals are strictly controlled, typically consisting of watery soup and bread, just enough to keep them alive, but never enough to provide comfort. Even their activities are limited. Prisoners are only allowed to read religious or legal books, and there is no form of recreation or entertainment. Unlike other prisons, where inmates sometimes form gangs or alliances, there is no social interaction at Black Dolphin. Each prisoner exists in complete isolation, unable to communicate with others. The psychological effects of this extreme solitude are devastating, often leading to mental breakdowns, paranoia, and in some cases, total insanity. The prison's design ensures that inmates have no way of influencing each other, preventing the spread of gang activity or organized resistance. While some argue that the harsh conditions at Black Dolphin are necessary due to the crimes committed by its inmates, others believe that the psychological torture inflicted on prisoners is inhumane. The extreme measures taken by the prison system ensure that Black Dolphin remains one of the most secure and feared correctional facilities in the world, a place where the worst criminals are sent to disappear, never to be heard from again. Diyarbakir Prison in Turkey was infamous for its torture methods. Diyarbakir Prison in Turkey is widely regarded as one of the most brutal and inhumane correctional facilities in history, particularly during the 1980s and 1990s. Unlike many of the world's most dangerous prisons, where violence is often caused by gang rivalries or lack of control, Diyarbakir was infamous for the deliberate and systematic torture carried out by the prison authorities themselves. It was not just a place of imprisonment, but a place of suffering, where inmates, many of whom were political prisoners, were subjected to unimaginable cruelty at the hands of their captors. During the 1980s, following the Turkish military coup of 1980, Diyarbakir Prison became a place where thousands of political dissidents, activists, and Kurdish nationalists were incarcerated. Many of these prisoners were not hardened criminals, but individuals accused of rebelling against the government or simply expressing opposing political views. Once inside Diyarbakir, these prisoners were treated with unrelenting brutality, stripped of their dignity, and forced to endure some of the worst human rights violations in modern prison history. One of the defining characteristics of Diyarbakir Prison was the widespread use of torture as a daily practice. Prison guards and military officers employed various forms of physical and psychological abuse to break the spirit of inmates. Some of the most horrific methods included severe beatings. Guards would beat prisoners relentlessly, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness or death. The beatings were often carried out using batons, wooden sticks, or even iron rods. Electric shock torture. Inmates were subjected to electric shocks on sensitive areas of their bodies, including their genitals, as a way to inflict maximum pain. Waterboarding and drowning simulations. Prisoners were often tied down and had water poured over their faces or were forcibly submerged to simulate the experience of drowning. Sexual assault and humiliation. One of the most disturbing aspects of Diyarbakir's brutality was the sexual abuse inflicted upon prisoners, including rape, forced nudity, and other humiliating acts meant to strip them of their humanity. Sleep deprivation and psychological abuse. Guards would keep prisoners awake for days, playing loud noises, shouting at them, or subjecting them to extreme cold or heat to break their mental state. Forcing prisoners to eat human waste. In some of the most shocking reports, prisoners were allegedly forced to consume feces and urine, demonstrating the level of inhumanity within the prison. These torture methods were not only used for punishment, but also as a tool for psychological warfare, designed to make inmates betray their comrades, renounce their beliefs, or lose all hope of resistance. Some prisoners were driven to the brink of insanity, while others died from their injuries or took their own lives to escape the horrors they endured. One of the most tragic events linked to Diyarbakir prison was the hunger strikes of 1982, during which prisoners protested their treatment by refusing to eat. In response, prison authorities used forced feeding methods, often leading to fatal consequences. Some prisoners burned themselves alive in acts of extreme desperation, choosing death over continued suffering. These events gained international attention and highlighted the severe human rights abuses happening behind Diyarbakir's walls. Even after the 1980s, Diyarbakir prison remained notorious for its harsh conditions and continued mistreatment of inmates. It became a symbol of oppression, particularly against Kurdish political prisoners, who were often detained under harsh conditions without fair trials. The prison's legacy of horror has left lasting scars on Turkish society, with former inmates still recounting their traumatic experiences decades later. Over time, international organizations and human rights activists began calling for the prison's closure due to its long history of torture and inhumane conditions. Eventually, Diyarbakir prison was closed in 2022, marking the end of one of the darkest chapters in Turkey's penal history. However, the stories of what happened within its walls continue to serve as a warning of the dangers of unchecked power, political persecution, and human rights violations within the prison system. San Pedro prison in Bolivia functions like a lawless city inside its walls. San Pedro prison in Bolivia is unlike any other correctional facility in the world. Instead of being a traditional high-security prison where guards and officials enforce strict control, San Pedro operates more like a self-governing city, run entirely by its inmates. Within its walls, prisoners have created their own social structure, economy, and laws, making it one of the most bizarre and dangerous prisons in existence. Located in the heart of La Paz, Bolivia, San Pedro was originally designed to hold only a few hundred inmates. However, over time, the prison population grew into the thousands, leading to severe overcrowding and a complete breakdown of traditional prison management. The Bolivian government, unable to maintain order, allowed inmates to take control, creating an environment where prisoners live with their families, operate businesses, and enforce their own set of rules. One of the most striking aspects of San Pedro is that prisoners must pay for their cells. Unlike most prisons where cells are assigned based on security levels, at San Pedro, inmates must buy or rent their own living spaces. Those who can afford it live in comfortable private rooms equipped with televisions, kitchens, and even internet access, while poorer inmates are forced to sleep on the floor in overcrowded conditions. Wealthy prisoners enjoy a relatively luxurious life, hiring other inmates as servants or bodyguards, while those with no money struggle to survive. San Pedro functions like a small town, complete with restaurants, barbershops, markets, and even a hotel for visitors. Many inmates run businesses, selling everything from food and clothing to illegal drugs. Since prisoners are allowed to have their families live with them, there are even children growing up inside the prison, attending makeshift schools run by inmates. While this arrangement may seem unusual, it reflects the complete lack of government oversight and the desperate need for inmates to create a livable environment within the prison walls. However, beneath this seemingly self-sufficient society lies a dark underworld of crime, violence, and corruption. Since official guards rarely enter the prison, gangs and powerful inmates enforce their own brutal laws. Those who break the rules can face severe punishments, including beatings, torture, or even death. Extortion is rampant, with weaker prisoners forced to pay for protection or risk being targeted by criminal groups. One of the most dangerous aspects of San Pedro is its deep involvement in the drug trade. The prison is known for its large-scale cocaine production, with inmates manufacturing and selling drugs both inside and outside the facility. Some of Bolivia's most powerful drug lords operate freely from within San Pedro's walls, using corrupt guards and external connections to continue their criminal empires. The authorities, either unwilling or unable to stop this, have allowed the illegal drug trade to flourish, making the prison a hub of organized crime. Despite its chaotic nature and lawlessness, San Pedro continues to function, defying conventional prison systems. It remains a place where survival depends not on following the law, but on one's ability to navigate the unspoken rules set by the prison's criminal hierarchy. For some, it offers a strange sense of freedom within confinement, while for others, it is a nightmare where only the strongest can endure. The unique nature of San Pedro raises important questions about justice, rehabilitation, and the role of prison systems in society, as it blurs the line between punishment and survival in one of the world's most unusual and dangerous correctional facilities. Tadmor Prison in Syria was known for its extreme brutality and mass executions. Tadmor Prison, located in the Syrian desert near the city of Palmyra, was one of the most notorious and brutal prisons in the world. Originally built as a military facility, it became infamous for its unimaginable cruelty, mass executions, and relentless torture. Over the decades, Tadmor served as a site of political oppression, where thousands of prisoners, many of them detained without fair trials, were subjected to some of the worst human rights violations in modern history. Under the rule of Hafez al-Assad and later his son, Bashar al-Assad, Tadmor became a place of fear and death, used primarily to silence political dissidents, activists, and anyone suspected of opposing the Syrian government. Many of the prisoners held within its walls were not hardened criminals, but students, intellectuals, and civilians who had been accused, often without evidence, of participating in anti-government activities. Once inside Tadmor, these prisoners disappeared into a living nightmare, where survival was uncertain and death was often delivered without warning. One of the most horrific events in Tadmor's history occurred on June 27, 1980. Following a failed assassination attempt on President Hafez al-Assad by the Muslim Brotherhood, Syrian troops were sent into Tadmor with orders to carry out a mass execution. In what is now known as the Tadmor Prison Massacre, soldiers stormed the cells and slaughtered between 500 and 1,000 prisoners in a single day. Reports from survivors describe how the soldiers, armed with machine guns, lined up prisoners and executed them in waves, while others were brutally beaten to death with clubs and iron bars. The massacre was meant to send a message. Opposition to the regime would be met with merciless brutality. The torture methods used in Tadmor were beyond cruel. Prisoners endured extreme physical and psychological abuse, including severe beatings and whippings. Inmates were regularly beaten with metal rods, electric cables, and wooden sticks until they lost consciousness or died. Hanging torture. Some prisoners were suspended from the ceiling by their wrists for hours or even days, their shoulders often dislocating from the sheer weight of their bodies. The German chair, torture. One of the most infamous forms of torture, this device was designed to bend a prisoner's spine backward until it snapped, often causing permanent paralysis or death. Electrocution. Prisoners were subjected to electric shocks on their genitals, tongues, and other sensitive areas, leaving many with severe burns and nerve damage. Psychological torture. Some inmates were kept in total darkness for months, while others were forced to listen to the screams of their fellow prisoners being tortured or executed. Another horrifying aspect of Tadmor was the randomness of the executions. Prisoners never knew if they would survive another day, as names were drawn at random for execution, often without explanation. Guards would drag inmates out of their cells at night, sometimes forcing others to watch as they were shot, hanged, or beaten to death. The psychological trauma of never knowing when death would come drove many prisoners to madness, making Tadmor not just a prison of physical suffering, but one of complete psychological destruction. Even for those who managed to survive Tadmor's relentless torture and executions, the conditions inside the prison were inhumane. The cells were filthy, overcrowded, and filled with disease, with little access to food, clean water, or medical care. Prisoners were often starved, eating nothing more than scraps of rotten food or moldy bread. Many succumbed to infections, untreated wounds, or starvation, as medical care was virtually non-existent. Tadmor Prison's brutal reputation eventually caught the attention of international human rights organizations, but the Syrian regime refused to allow outside access. The horrors inside remained largely hidden, with only a handful of survivors living to tell the world what happened behind its walls. In 2015, ISIS militants attacked and destroyed the prison, leveling it to the ground. While the destruction of Tadmor Prison marked the end of its physical existence, the memory of the suffering endured within its walls remains a dark stain on Syria's history. Rikers Island in New York has a reputation for violence, corruption, and inhumane conditions. Rikers Island, one of the most infamous prisons in the United States, is notorious for its violence, corruption, and inhumane living conditions. Located in the East River between the Bronx and Queens, this massive correctional facility is one of the largest jail complexes in the world, housing thousands of inmates at any given time. Despite being a short-term detention center primarily holding pretrial detainees who have not been convicted of a crime, Rikers has gained a dark reputation as a place of brutality, neglect, and systemic abuse. One of the most disturbing aspects of Rikers Island is its extreme levels of violence. Fights between inmates are common, often escalating into full-blown riots. Many detainees are young, vulnerable, and unprepared for the brutal realities of life behind bars. Gangs operate freely inside the facility, controlling different sections and targeting weaker inmates for extortion, beatings, and even sexual assault. The atmosphere is one of constant fear and survival, where inmates must either align with a gang or risk becoming a target. However, the violence at Rikers is not just inmate on inmate. Correctional officers have repeatedly been accused of excessive force, abuse, and even orchestrating attacks on detainees. Numerous reports have surfaced of guards beating inmates to the point of hospitalization, often as punishment for minor infractions. In some cases, officers have been found guilty of facilitating fights between prisoners for entertainment, an illegal practice known as gladiator fights. Whistleblowers have described a culture of brutality, where guards regularly cover up violence by filing false reports or threatening witnesses into silence. Perhaps the most infamous case of abuse at Rikers Island is the tragic story of Khalif Browder. In 2010, at just 16 years old, Khalif was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack, an accusation that was never proven. Since his family could not afford bail, he was sent to Rikers Island, where he spent nearly 3 years awaiting trial, including nearly 2 years in solitary confinement. During his time at Rikers, he was repeatedly beaten by both inmates and guards, denied adequate mental health treatment, and subjected to horrific psychological torture. Eventually, his charges were dropped, and he was released, but the trauma he endured left him deeply scarred. In 2015, Khalif tragically took his own life, bringing national attention to the horrors of Rikers Island and the injustices within the U.S. criminal justice system. Another major issue at Rikers is the inhumane living conditions. The jail is overcrowded, unsanitary, and severely understaffed, leading to horrific neglect of inmates. Cells are often infested with rats, cockroaches, and mold, while access to basic necessities such as clean water, edible food, and medical care is limited. Inmates suffering from medical emergencies or mental health crises frequently go untreated, leading to unnecessary deaths. There have been multiple reports of inmates dying from preventable illnesses, dehydration, and suicide simply because they were ignored by staff. Rikers Island is also notorious for its horrific treatment of mentally ill inmates. Many detainees suffer from serious mental health conditions, yet instead of receiving proper psychiatric care, they are thrown into solitary confinement, where their conditions often deteriorate. Solitary confinement at Rikers, referred to as the Bing, is a form of psychological torture with inmates locked inside a tiny cell for 23 hours a day, often for months or even years at a time. Studies have shown that prolonged solitary confinement leads to severe mental deterioration, hallucinations, and suicidal tendencies. Yet Rikers has continued to use this method as a form of punishment. Corruption within the jail is another major crisis. Many correctional officers and staff members participate in smuggling drugs, weapons, and contraband into the facility, further fueling the violence inside. Some guards accept bribes from gang leaders, looking the other way while criminal activities take place. Others have been caught physically and sexually abusing inmates, knowing that complaints against them are rarely investigated. Due to its long history of abuse, neglect, and extreme violence, Rikers Island has become a symbol of everything wrong with the American prison system. Human rights organizations, former inmates, and activists have called for its closure, arguing that the facility is beyond reform. In recent years, New York City officials have announced plans to shut down Rikers Island by 2027, replacing it with smaller, borough-based jails that are meant to be more humane. However, critics argue that unless deep-rooted systemic issues are addressed, such as corruption, excessive force, and poor mental health care, closing Rikers will not fix the broader problems within the criminal justice system. Gitarama prison in Rwanda was so overcrowded that inmates were forced to stand for days. Gitarama prison in Rwanda is one of the most horrifically overcrowded prisons in history, a place where inmates endured conditions so extreme that survival often depended on sheer luck. Located in the heart of Rwanda, Gitarama was originally built to house around 500 prisoners. However, following the Rwandan genocide of 1994, the prison became so overwhelmed with detainees that it held up to 7,000 inmates at its peak, more than 14 times its intended capacity. The consequences of this extreme overcrowding were catastrophic, making Gitarama one of the most inhumane prisons in the world. The most horrifying aspect of Gitarama prison was that there was literally no space to move, sit, or even lie down. The cells were so packed that inmates were forced to stand shoulder to shoulder for days, weeks, or even months at a time. The floor space was entirely occupied by human bodies, making rest nearly impossible. Inmates had to fight for even the smallest patches of space, and many collapsed from exhaustion or suffocated due to the lack of ventilation. Those who fell were often trampled to death by the thousands of other prisoners struggling to stay upright. With such severe overcrowding, basic human necessities like food, water, and sanitation were almost non-existent. The prison provided minimal rations, often just one meal per day, consisting of a small amount of cornmeal or beans, not nearly enough to sustain prisoners in such harsh conditions. Water was scarce, and many inmates suffered from severe dehydration, their lips cracking and their bodies weakening as they went days without proper hydration. The absence of bathrooms meant that prisoners had to relieve themselves where they stood, leading to a horrifying buildup of human waste, disease, and unbearable stench inside the prison. With thousands of people packed into a confined space, diseases spread rapidly, turning Gitarama into a breeding ground for deadly infections. One of the most notorious health crises inside the prison was gangrene, a condition where flesh begins to rot due to lack of blood circulation. Inmates, forced to stand for days in filthy, unsanitary conditions, would develop severe infections in their feet and legs, leading to blackened, decaying skin. Many prisoners suffered from untreated wounds and open sores, which quickly became infected with maggots and bacteria, leading to an agonizingly slow death. Without medical care, the only treatment available was amputation with crude tools, often performed by other prisoners who had no medical training. The lack of food and constant state of desperation led to some of the most horrifying acts of survival: cannibalism. With so many inmates dying daily due to starvation and disease, their bodies often lay rotting on the prison floor for days before being removed. Some prisoners, driven to the brink of insanity by hunger, resorted to eating the flesh of the dead just to stay alive. Witnesses who survived Gitarama later described scenes of prisoners tearing at corpses, eating whatever they could find in a desperate attempt to survive. The fact that inmates turned to cannibalism out of necessity is a chilling testament to the absolute horror of Gitarama prison. Adding to the nightmare of Gitarama was the complete lack of law and order within its walls. With so many prisoners and so little oversight, violence was a constant reality. Stronger inmates preyed on the weak, forming violent gangs that controlled access to food, water, and even small areas of standing room. Fights broke out daily over the most basic necessities, and those who were too weak to defend themselves were often beaten to death. The prison guards, overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates, rarely intervened, leaving prisoners to govern themselves in a state of total chaos. Gitarama prison was not meant to be a permanent home for the thousands of people trapped inside. Many of the inmates had been arrested in the chaotic aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, often without trial or clear charges. The Rwandan government, struggling to deal with the overwhelming number of suspected genocide perpetrators, simply threw people into Gitarama with no legal process. Many inmates had no idea when or if they would ever be released, leading to a sense of hopelessness and psychological torment. Some prisoners, unable to endure the suffering, took their own lives, seeing death as a preferable fate to the horrors of Gitarama. Despite international outcry and reports exposing the unimaginable suffering inside Gitarama, it took years before conditions began to improve. Over time, Rwanda's prison system attempted to reduce overcrowding, transferring prisoners to other facilities and implementing judicial reforms. However, the trauma and suffering endured by those who lived through Gitarama remain an indelible mark on history. Even today, the stories of unspeakable horror from within its walls serve as a grim reminder of the consequences of mass incarceration, neglect, and the failure of human rights protections. The Black Dolphin prison in Russia holds the most dangerous criminals under extreme security measures. The Black Dolphin prison, officially known as Penal Colony No. 6, is one of the most secure and notorious prisons in Russia. Located near the Kazakhstan border, this facility is reserved for the country's most dangerous criminals, including serial killers, terrorists, cannibals, and high-profile gang members. The prison has a reputation for being inescapable, with a strict regime designed to completely break the will of inmates, ensuring that those inside will never pose a threat to society again. The nickname Black Dolphin comes from a statue of a black dolphin sculpted by inmates, which now sits outside the prison gates as an ominous symbol of what lies within. Unlike ordinary prisons, Black Dolphin functions more like a high-security fortress, where prisoners are subjected to constant surveillance, brutal living conditions, and a strict daily routine that leaves no room for disobedience or hope of escape. One of the most extreme aspects of Black Dolphin is the intake process. When new inmates arrive, they are immediately blindfolded and physically restrained, ensuring they cannot memorize the layout of the prison. This prevents them from ever knowing their exact location within the facility, making escape nearly impossible. The prisoners are also forced into a stress position, where they must bend at a 90-degree angle while being led by armed guards. This posture is designed to keep them completely vulnerable, unable to resist or gain any sense of control over their surroundings. Once inside, prisoners are placed in small, reinforced concrete cells that are locked behind 3 layers of steel doors. Each cell measures just 50 square feet, barely large enough for a bed, a tiny table, and a toilet. The windows are positioned high above eye level, ensuring that inmates can never see outside, further isolating them from the outside world. The security measures at Black Dolphin are among the strictest in the world. Prisoners are kept under 24-hour surveillance, with cameras monitoring their every move. Even at night, guards patrol regularly to ensure no one is attempting an escape. Inmates are not allowed to sit or rest on their beds during the day, as they must remain active and stand in their cells when they are not sleeping. This strict regulation prevents prisoners from becoming comfortable or complacent, reinforcing the psychological control that the prison exerts over them. The daily routine at Black Dolphin is designed to completely break the spirit of inmates. Each prisoner receives only 90 minutes of exercise per day, during which they are taken to a small, enclosed outdoor area surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. During this time, they are constantly monitored, and any deviation from the rules is met with swift punishment. Meals consist of simple porridge, soup, and bread, just enough to keep inmates alive, but never enough to provide comfort. Many prisoners lose significant amounts of weight due to the lack of nutrition and the relentless stress of the prison environment. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Black Dolphin is that the majority of its inmates will never leave. Almost every prisoner inside has been sentenced to life without parole, meaning they will spend the rest of their days in total isolation, cut off from the outside world forever. There are no rehabilitation programs, no chance for appeals, and no hope for a second chance. The prison's philosophy is simple. Those who enter Black Dolphin will die inside its walls. Many of the prisoners inside Black Dolphin have committed some of the most heinous crimes in Russian history. Serial killers, child murderers, and cannibals make up a large percentage of the population. Some inmates have confessed to killing dozens of people, while others were part of organized crime syndicates responsible for brutal massacres. The guards treat all inmates the same, regardless of their crimes, ensuring that no one receives special treatment or leniency. Psychological torment is a constant reality inside Black Dolphin. The extreme isolation, rigid schedule, and lack of any human connection slowly deteriorate the minds of prisoners. Many inmates experience severe depression, hallucinations, and paranoia, as they are trapped in a place where every day feels the same, with no hope of escape or redemption. The sheer monotony and lack of stimulation lead many prisoners to lose their sense of time, making years feel like an endless loop of suffering. Despite its brutal conditions, Russian authorities defend Black Dolphin's existence by arguing that it serves an important purpose: to permanently remove the worst criminals from society, ensuring that they never harm anyone again. Unlike some prisons that focus on rehabilitation, Black Dolphin's goal is pure containment. There is no pretense of reform or reintegration into society. In the eyes of the Russian government, the men inside Black Dolphin are beyond saving, and their only fate is to live out their days in complete isolation until they die. San Pedro prison in Bolivia operates like a small city, with inmates running businesses and even living with their families. San Pedro prison, located in La Paz, Bolivia, is unlike any other prison in the world. Rather than functioning as a traditional high-security facility, it operates as a self-governing community, where inmates run their own businesses, purchase their own accommodations, and even live with their families. While this might sound like a more humane approach to incarceration, the reality inside San Pedro is chaotic, dangerous, and riddled with corruption, making it one of the most unusual and dangerous prisons in the world. Unlike most prisons, where cells are assigned by authorities, at San Pedro, inmates must buy their own living space. Upon arrival, a prisoner who does not have money is either forced to sleep in the open courtyard or must quickly find a way to earn enough cash to rent or buy a cell. The prison is divided into different neighborhoods, each with its own economy, class system, and level of comfort. Wealthy inmates live in luxurious cells with televisions, private bathrooms, and even kitchens, while the poorest inmates sleep on concrete floors or share cramped spaces with multiple people. One of the most bizarre and controversial aspects of San Pedro is that many prisoners live with their wives and children inside the prison walls. Since there is no formal separation between inmates and civilians, entire families reside in San Pedro, creating an environment that resembles a lawless town rather than a correctional facility. Children grow up inside the prison, attending makeshift schools, playing in the courtyard, and interacting with convicted criminals daily. While this arrangement allows families to stay together, it also exposes children to extreme violence, drug abuse, and criminal activities, which are rampant within the prison community. San Pedro is largely run by the inmates themselves, with minimal intervention from prison guards. The Bolivian government provides very little funding or oversight, meaning prisoners must create their own systems of governance, law enforcement, and commerce. Inmates elect their own leaders, who enforce rules and resolve disputes, often through violent means. Corrupt guards accept bribes to look the other way, allowing criminal organizations to flourish inside the prison walls. One of the most profitable businesses inside San Pedro is drug production. Bolivia is one of the largest producers of cocaine, and within the prison, inmates manufacture and sell cocaine openly, often with the knowledge or cooperation of corrupt officials. Some of the highest-earning inmates run fully functional cocaine labs, smuggling their product out of the prison using family members and visitors. This has turned San Pedro into a major hub for the illegal drug trade, where gang leaders and drug lords control entire sections of the facility. Violence is a constant reality inside the prison. With no official law enforcement, inmates police themselves, leading to frequent brutal beatings, stabbings, and even murders. If a prisoner fails to pay debts, disrespects the wrong person, or is caught stealing, they can face severe punishments, including torture or death. Gang wars erupt regularly, and since the prison is overcrowded and understaffed, there is little to stop the bloodshed. Despite its dangers, San Pedro has become a strange tourist attraction over the years. At one point, corrupt guards allowed foreign travelers to enter the prison for paid tours, where they could interact with inmates, witness the prison's economy in action, and even purchase drugs. Some tourists reported being taken to high-class inmate suites, where prisoners offered them luxury accommodations in exchange for money. Others described the experience as terrifying, with armed inmates controlling different sections of the prison and foreign visitors being warned not to venture too far without a guide. Eventually, after international criticism, the Bolivian government cracked down on these tours, but stories of the lawlessness inside San Pedro continue to circulate. Life inside San Pedro is a test of survival. Inmates who lack money or protection are at the mercy of gangs and violent criminals, and without any structured rehabilitation programs, many prisoners leave worse than when they arrived. For some, the prison represents an opportunity to make money, gain power, and live in relative comfort, while for others, it is a brutal, lawless world where only the strongest survive, that a glimpse into humanity's darkest prisons. From the brutal violence of Rikers Island to the inhumane overcrowding of Gitarama prison, from the psychological torment of Black Dolphin to the lawless chaos of San Pedro, these prisons represent some of the most terrifying and oppressive environments in the world. Each of them tells a story of neglect, corruption, extreme punishment, and the failure of justice systems to protect basic human rights. While some of these prisons exist to contain the most dangerous criminals, others trap innocent people, pretrial detainees, and those without the resources to defend themselves, turning incarceration into a death sentence. The conditions in these prisons raise serious ethical questions. How much punishment is too much? Can a prison truly rehabilitate, or does it only create more violence? Where do we draw the line between justice and cruelty? Ultimately, these prisons serve as a stark reminder of what happens when humanity abandons compassion, oversight, and reform. If we're to create a truly fair and just society, we must rethink the way we treat prisoners, address corruption, and seek alternatives to systems that dehumanize instead of rehabilitate. Because a world where such prisons exist is not just a failure of the criminal justice system, it is a failure of humanity itself.